obviously you're trying to avoid that as much as possible. And do you, and I assume you're taking into, I guess what I'm asking, is there an escalation effect by using the less lethal tools that is taken into consideration in the level 5 and level 6? And I guess I'm just trying to understand more about how that's processed as well,
right? Do you
right?
want to answer that?
Yeah.
So I'll give it a shot. So the considerations that are laid out in the policy, and this is why, we've got huge numbers of pages on policies. And you have to read 14090, which is the crowd management policy, in conjunction with 8300, which is the less lethal weapons. We also have our mutual aid policy that explains how we're going to manage other people that come to support us in the field.
I mean, I think I would say it depends, right? Like, yeah, you're taking in the totality of the circumstances of what's in front of you. Is one of the considerations, is it going to potentially escalate the situation? Yes. Yeah. And an incident commander will be making the decision about that, not necessarily these guys. So basically, they're just doing what we're asking them to do.
Right.
So when you're in that position and you're making those decisions, yes, we're looking at all the factors. And is it reasonable? Is it necessary? Is it proportional? Is it an imminent thing that we need to take action right away? Right. So, I mean, yes, we consider that, but obviously it's serious enough where we're at the level 5 and 6 that we need to do something. If that makes a...
Yeah, the level 5 and 6 preempts any discussion of this. Right, so you have to get to a certain level before you even...
Right, because we're already
Yeah, I understand.
Going up that continuum.
I was just wondering if it's part of the calculus.
Yes, absolutely.
Helpful.
And again, all of our policies and training are designed to avoid getting to level 5
right.
and 6 the best we can.
And I think it's also important to note that if we go to level 5 and level 6 in the CMIC, it's not a free-for-all. We don't just start hitting people with these weapons.
Right.
We still have to adhere to our use of force policy. That person still needs to be doing something that causes an imminent threat to us, an imminent threat to somebody else, and our force use has to still be reasonable, necessary, and proportional. So I don't want to give the impression that once the incident commander declares, level 6, that it's game on. We're just going to start, using force on everybody. That's not the way it works for us.
It's like going from a red light to a yellow light.
We still have to follow our use of force policy, and there still has to be a threat for us to address. If we go to level 6 and everybody decides we're leaving, and they leave, then there's no force to be used.
Right.
So
it's a constant assessment, right? You have to modulate that force. So I mean, it's not as easy to just say, oh, we're going to do this one time, or we're going to do that. I mean, we're constantly assessing and modulating the level of force.
And built into all that, to just keep harping on this, is if it comes down to the point where we are ordering a dispersal, you order the dispersal, we're using the LRAD to communicate that so people can hear. We have an officer stationed at the back that can hear and confirm, thumbs up, this is audible. Then you give time for people to disperse. Then you give another warning. This is all laid out in the policy. And then and in that warning, it says we may use less lethal weapons to disperse this crowd if you don't go away. And we have anti-kettling in our policy and our training. We have to give them an egress route to go. So the whole point is we're trying to slow this stuff down, and I guess nobody wants to know.
We're done listening.
Apparently I've exhausted my words for the day, so I'll stand down.
People are having a lot of...
Critical audience member.
Okay, Lieutenant Hendry, thank you. Officer Musso, thank you. We're going to head out of here. I have a different engagement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for
I'll hang out to take the
Whatever.
Well, again, thank you, SP, for coming to present. I do want to move on to the next segment of this discussion. I know, as you heard earlier from Commissioner Gadke, the Police Practices Work Group has held, I think, at least 3 meetings on this topic in the last month. Since the Mayor's office provided the CPC with their proposed ordinance. And so I want to turn it over to the Police Practices Work Group and Danny to present to where the work group is currently with this project. Of course, ultimately leading to the CPC providing input to the City Council on the proposed ordinance. I'd love to hear, and I'm sure this is part of your presentation, kind of some of the history of where the CPC has been on, the ordinances that I just asked Mr. Maxey about from 2020
Yeah.
2021. So
Yeah.
go ahead, turn it over to the Police Practices Work Group.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Danny, Senior Policy Analyst here at the CPC, staff lead for the Police Practices Work Group. So on behalf of the work group, I'm going to give a presentation on the work that we've been doing over the past few weeks, analyzing Mayor Harrell's proposed crowd management ordinance. Next slide, please. Okay, nope. Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to establish our goals for this presentation. First is to inform the Greater Commission and everyone and all of our attendees today a little bit about the history and timeline of crowd management in Seattle. So that includes court orders and crowd management ordinances, which we talked a little bit about today, and then CPC's past involvement in crowd management issues, and then cover what the ordinance will and won't do to sort of mitigate any misconceptions of that. Then we're going to report out on our analysis of the ordinance and our preliminary feedback, and the survey that we've issued, and then we're going to open a discussion with the commission and everyone here about what we talked about, and then make a plan moving forward. Next slide, please. Okay, cool. So to give some context, I know this is kind of small, but I hope everyone can see it. We've made this nice little timeline to visualize a short history of court orders and crowd management policies in Seattle. This starts in 2020. There's a much longer history than that, but that would also require a much longer timeline and several more hours, and there's just not the space or time on the screen in our lives. So we'll start in 2020 because that was really the beginning of a lot of the evolution around crowd management here. So if you can't see, I'm going to try to just go through the timeline. Around the time of several protests surrounding the murder of George Floyd, the U.S. District Court issued a preliminary injunction regarding SPD crowd control measures. Greg Doss covered a lot of this very eloquently before, but I'm just going to reiterate it. And then shortly after that injunction, the City Council proposed to adopt Ordinance 126102, which was the first attempt at passing a crowd control ordinance. And this aimed to prohibit the acquisition and the use of all less lethal weapons in crowd control. And this was in direct response to the handling of the George Floyd protest in 2020, which we've acknowledged, Ryan Maxey acknowledged, there was a lot of mishandling of those protests. And so City Council attempted to pass this ordinance. Mayor Durkin declined to sign the ordinance for several reasons that Brian mentioned earlier, including that it went against a lot of national best practices and undermined accountability partners as well as the federal court injunction. So the following year, in 2021, SPD submitted and the court approved revisions to their internal crowd management policies, which I believe are largely still in effect today. I know that they're ever evolving, but those revisions that were approved in 2020, we're still operating under. So then later in 2020, City Council attempted to adopt a second ordinance, Ordinance 126422, which was very similar to previous ordinance, but had a host of other issues, which is why Mayor Durkin also declined to sign that one. So that brings us, skipping over a couple years, brings us to 2024. There's currently no city policy in place regarding crowd management, which we covered. And then in the consent decree hearing in October, Judge Robart announced that the city needs to finalize and submit final policies on crowd management before the consent decree can end. And that's really the last component required to end the consent decree. So after the hearing, that same day, Mayor Harrell submitted a new ordinance for City Council review. That review is expected to begin at the City Council level on December 10th and continue through January. So that's sort of a brief history. What is the CPC's role in this? We have been asked to provide input to inform City Council's review. And then next slide please, I'll give a little history of CPC's involvement in crowd management. So another timeline. Essentially what this says is that CPC has been involved in giving feedback to SPD and the city since at least 2015. As far as my documents go back, I'm sure they were before that too. So 2015, CPC submitted comments and memos in response to Ferguson and Black Lives Matter demonstrations. 2016, CPC sends letters, memos to city partners regarding the use of blast balls. 2020, CPC and accountability partners submitted a joint statement on the use of tear gas and SPD's response to demonstrations in the wake of George Floyd. Also in 2020, CPC submits recommendations regarding Ordinance 102. And then 2021, CPC submits recommendations on SPD's revised crime management policies. There's obviously been a lot more involvement, but this is just sort of to cover, since 2015 up until now, CPC has been heavily involved, submitting recommendations, letters, joint statements. Next slide, please. So to cover any misconceptions about what the ordinance covers, we wanted to first cover what it won't do and what we're not being asked for feedback on at this moment. So the ordinance is not going to prescribe which less than lethal weapons SPD can use. So we just had a demonstration on the specific weapons to sort of help inform our outlook on the issue, but we are not being asked to give feedback on which weapons we think SPD should use and when. We're not being asked to define, the ordinance won't define circumstances considered objectively reasonable and necessary to use less than lethal weapons. That is defined in SPD internal policies. It also won't prescribe which types of trainings SPD officers must attend. Next slide, please. So what the ordinance will do, ordinances and most legislation provide high-level requirements to inform departments' policies, right? So this ordinance is going to provide those guardrails, those guidelines to inform SPD's crowd management policies. We took specific language from the ordinance, and over the next couple of slides I'm just going to read it because the ordinance is pretty short, and this is exactly what the ordinance lays out to do. So first, it's requiring any police use of force for crowd control be objectively reasonable, necessary, and proportional to the threat presented. We'll get more into these in the police practice analysis in a bit. It prohibits the use of less lethal tools on a person or persons for crowd control purposes unless specific facts and circumstances are occurring or about to occur that create an imminent risk of physical injury to any person or significant property damage. And then it mandates SPD policy continue to require approval by an incident commander supervisor before less than lethal tools may be used for general crowd dispersal. Next slide. And we'll get more into the specifics in a bit. The ordinance mandates that SPD officers may only use less lethal tools expressly authorized by SPD policy and for which the officer has been trained. Maintains the right to free speech and peaceful assembly guaranteed by First Amendment and the Washington State Constitution. It acknowledges the role of SPD in facilitating safe gatherings, and it mandates that de-escalation, engagement, and dialogue should be prioritized in crowd management efforts for SPD and event organizers. Next slide. And then the last slide on what it's going to do, it reiterates state-level regulations on the use of tear gas, which Brian covered earlier. It reiterates the city's compliance with collective bargaining, which is a whole other conversation, requires SPD to publish its crowd management policy and any future revisions to its website, and mandates SPD to collaborate with OIG to create an annual report on the use of force in crowd management situations. All right, so now we'll get into our analysis of a few of these provisions. And I'm listing sort of the key ones that we focused on. So in this, we went through the ordinance provision by provision, developed questions we wanted clarity on, and received answers through our research as well as conversations with various partners. So first, in regards to the objectively reasonable, necessary, and proportional to the threat presented, We asked who defines objectively reasonable, necessary, proportional, and we learned that in this Supreme Court case, Graham v. Connor, 1989, it established this standard, this objectively reasonable standard for the use of force in law enforcement, and that has become the national standard, a national best practice. As Brian said, these are more ever-evolving practices and standards, but this is what is widely used across the country, to use this language and give the agency discretion to specifically define the circumstances that are reasonable. And these are more clearly defined in SPD's crowd management policy. And then what does this look like in practice? In SPD's crowd management, there are specific levels laid out, which we talked about before. There's level 1, level 2, it goes all the way to 6. And those are very clear in how this is used in practice and what circumstances warrant which tool, which use of force. Like we said before, when it gets to level 4, they focus on removing the individual who is presenting the threat before resorting to levels 5 and 6, which require approval by highly ranked officers. We'll get to that again shortly. Next slide, please. So we wanted to know, so the next one prohibits the use of less lethal, unless specific facts and circumstances are occurring or about to occur that create an imminent risk of physical injury to any person or significant damage. So what we wanted to know what less than lethal weapons are available for SBT to use in crowd control and what their effect is. I won't go into this because we just had a whole presentation on it. But we did, learn about all of this before. So the main ones used are the main tools that officers have at their discretion include pepper spray, tasers, 40mm launcher, pepper ball launchers, tear gas, and blast balls. We learned which ones are used typically in a useful tool in crowd management, which ones are useful in crowd dispersal, and which are not. I won't really go into that because we just spent a long time talking about it. So next slide, please. And then, the next provision mandates that SPD policy continue to require approval by incident commander or supervisor before tools may be used for general crowd dispersal. We asked why approval is only required for dispersal and not general crowd management. And the answer to that is because, as Brian Maxey said earlier, crowd dispersal is the most intrusive form of crowd control on a person's civil rights. So the stakes are much higher with dispersal versus management. And there's a vast difference between managing a crowd and dispersing a crowd. And we noted that difference is extremely salient and should be a big part of these conversations. So currently approval is required by an incident commander or supervisor. And as Brian Maxey said earlier, SBD plans on amending their policy so that the authority to approve a dispersal request is only handled by a lieutenant or higher ranked officer, because it is such an intrusion on civil rights. That's our preliminary analysis of the ordinance. And so now I'll move into our results of the survey that we issued. So as Commissioner Gacke said earlier, the police practices work group developed and issued a survey to gauge the current climate on crowd control. We've issued it to the commission at large, external accountability partners, and all of our constituents who are signed up to receive the CPC newsletter. And the survey will be live until January 6th so that we can report out the results on January 8th. But we did want to report on results so far. It's been live for a couple of weeks. I'll move into. So the responses have largely been right down the middle in regards to experiences and perspectives with SPD and crowd control. Key themes include, various experiences. Some respondents report positive interactions with SPD and crowd management, particularly those working with mental health populations or attending organized events. Others express strong concerns about excessive force, especially during the 2020 protests. Some policy perspectives. A segment of respondents support giving SPD more tools and more discretion. Others advocate for stricter oversight and limitations, so vast differences on either side. But across the board, responses emphasize the need for balance between public safety and protecting First Amendment rights. Next slide, please. So we asked respondents on a scale from 1 to 10 to rate SPD's use of less lethal weapons in crowd management, 1 being significantly dissatisfied and 10 being significantly satisfied. And then we also asked them to rate SPD in facilitating safe gatherings and upholding civilians' First Amendment rights using the same scale. So both show an average rating of 5.3 out of 10, with the median being 5. So right down the middle with respondents so far. Significant variation in opinions. Next slide. Using a different...
Danny, sorry to interrupt, but and sorry if I missed it, but how many responses have there been total?
Oh, thanks, yeah. So when I made this, there were 35, and since I checked yesterday, they were closer to 45. So there are some responses that were not included in this analysis. And like I said, like this is very preliminary, and I will be reporting out on the final results of the January 8th, but I did want to be transparent about what we have so far. So yes, this is 35 responses.
Danny, can I just do a quick time check? I just want to
Yeah,
make sure we have
yeah.
time for Lisa.
Sure. Okay, what would you like?
I just want to know how much time you think you need.
5 more minutes, I
Great.
think.
Is
Yeah,
that okay, Lisa?
I can make it, but,
We can go a little over after 11 too. I just wanted to check. Take it, Danny.
yeah. Okay, so, yeah. On a different scale, we asked respondents to what extent do you believe crowd management has improved since 2020? The largest group, 40% of respondents felt neutral about the changes since 2020, and then combined, 40% of respondents felt that things got worse or significantly worse, and then 20% felt things improved. So yeah, at the bottom, out of 35 total responses to this question, 24 of them provided elaborated on their responses. They provided detailed explanations, which I'll cover in this next slide. So yeah, there's, as the data suggests, that while some improvements have been noted in the areas of satisfaction, like better communication methods through the use of speakerphones, there's still a significant perception that crowd management practices need further improvement, with many respondents indicating more negative experiences than positive ones. So areas of concern: use of force during protests, need for clearer guidelines and accountability for the use of less than lethal, more balance between maintaining order and protecting civil rights, and then increased use of training and de-escalation tactics. Next slide. So then, we have some recommendations so far: need for clearer standards and guidelines for use less than lethal, which, is part of this conversation today. Need for improved training, better balance between crowd control, protection of First Amendment rights, and then more transparent communication about crowd management. So like I said, this is what we have so far. There's nothing conclusive about these results. I want to make that clear. This is not trying to say anything conclusive, but this is what we have so far. And I will do a deeper analysis in the next meeting. Next slide, please. So just a couple action items. We've already said this. Public safety hearing on December 10th. We've committed to providing some feedback. Another public safety hearing on January 14th. Also, we have committed to providing feedback. And then there's potential for council action on January 21st. Next slide. And then, And then discussion time, but might not be, I mean, that would be nice if we could all sort of have conversation about what we talked about today, but I definitely want to get to Lisa, and maybe we can come back to this, maybe we can make it part of the next meeting, but that's essentially all I have in my...
Thank you, Danny. As for the discussion and CPC action on this, one thing I just want to say before turning it over to Lisa, we will be discussing this at the January 8th meeting. And the intention is that we will be providing the CPC's feedback in a formal letter to the Public Safety Committee, Mr. Brent, prior to that. So the Public Safety Committee has the benefit of the CPC and the community's input via the survey. Additionally, and not to put Brian Maxey on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot, if and when an ordinance is enacted, isn't it true that SPD will have to then enact policies to affect that ordinance?
So Sort of yes and no. So the interim policy that we have is sort of 95% where we want it to be, and currently it is in compliance with the ordinance. There's a few tweaks we want to make, like the aforementioned lieutenant at the decision to order dispersal and you authorize less lethal weapons for crowd control. We are also ensuring that everywhere in our policy, it actually says substantial property damage. There's still some holdovers where it still is at the property damage level, so we need to bring all of that into alignment. I think there are a few other tweaks we're intending to make, but we're 95% there as soon as this order, and we will have that done by the 10th.
What I'm really getting at though is that there is typically opportunities for the CPC to engage with SPD on policy development and implementation. And so after the council and mayor complete whatever work they're going to do on the ordinance, there'll be continued opportunities for SPD and CPC to engage on the policy. That's what I'm just trying to get.
Sure. Yeah, but we're always, again, we're about iteration. We're always ready to engage in our intent, though, will be to get this policy in a completed form to the modern team in DOJ as soon as possible, right?
Yeah, the reason, sorry to just jump in here, but the reason that would be really important is that I notice as I think about the survey responses and things like that, a lot of those go to details that are maybe not covered as much in the ordinance, but would be covered in more detail in the policy. So it seems like there's a great deal of feedback from just that venue alone, along with things that I've heard of the police practices work group as well in our discussion yesterday. So I think that opportunity for input is really where there's going to be a lot that CPC can offer to the table, in addition to the feedback on the ordinance itself that we're offering already.
Lisa, thank you so much for being here. I'm really happy you're here.
I'm really glad to be here. In the interest of time, I'm going to go fast and try to hit high points only. Admire Joel's cross-examination of Brian. Recognize that skill set for my past life. So I was co-chair of the CPC for 6 years, from 2013 to 2019. And just confirming Danny's presentation that it really was 2014 in the post-Ferguson popular mobilizations that the CPC first began weighing in and was asked by members of the public to weigh in on crowd management issues. I want to say at the time we asked for Department of Justice and Monitor support for that work, and were explicitly told that this was outside the scope of the consent decree. So all of the work that was done up to 2020 we were on our own, and we did good work in partnership with many individuals from different community sectors over time who became very invested in this. I also want to name that in that span of time, the CPC was cognizant of and responsive to very diverse concerns in this area, not just from people who were in 2014 particularly. There was kettling, there was response to non-permitted Black Lives Matter marches that some within the department were very critical of. And so there was feedback from especially sergeants in the department who felt that they had been directed to do unconstitutional things, really appreciate their point of view. That was channeled through the CPC. It was really a high watermark of the CPC as sort of an information gathering point that was useful to rank and file members of the department. Also concerns from members of the command staff, your predecessor, who was representing SPMA at the time, participated in a community session at New Holly and was ultimately a signatory on our recommendations for reconsideration of crowd management from the point of view of people being subjected to it in a way that damaged police-community relationship. This is like high-level summary. There were also, so then in 2016, with the first election of Donald Trump as president, there was a new set of dynamics in which there were people engaged in popular mobilization who sought protection really from SPD against counter-protesters. And so that was a crowd management, a demand for crowd management that was around SPD being asked as a municipal police department to protect the rights, the speech and assembly rights of people who are feeling extremely vulnerable to federal policy, a set of circumstances that could very well come again. And so those were that was essentially like a request for service rather than a request for absence of SPD. I also just will say, my own perspective was a public defender. I have represented people who have been the subject of crowd management responses all the way going back to WTO 25 years ago. I have also been arrested falsely and got a tiny little settlement. Thank you, City Attorney's Office, for that post-WTO, and have been subjected to some of the less lethal tools along with many thousands of other people. And I recognize that many others who have been involved in these discussions through the CPC have had more acute experiences of all of these, but I do come to the topic with a particular interest and some firsthand experience. If I had been on this, I'm really going off script here. If I had been on the CPC in 2020, which it is not a coincidence that I was not, I left on purpose, but if I had been, I would have wished that the CPC opposed the ordinance of 2020 and the ordinance of 2021. I do not think that, and you'll note that while we tried to be very engaged in these issues and responsive to community concerns from 2014 to 2019, we were always urging, we were not urging the prohibition of any tool, including blast balls, and I'm going to come back to blast balls. We were flagging problems with the use of a particular tool and asking for a nuanced, well-informed conversation that was reality-based before the tools were put back in use. So comprehensive bars and bans do not make sense, and it can from my point of view, and that was certainly our approach, because of the potential unintended consequences of those bans, and the need for some response without appropriate tools can generate worse outcomes. Instead, our focus around crowd management was always around themes that I'm seeing and hearing articulated now by the mayor's office, by SPD, which we would have appreciated then, about avenues of egress, clear communication, setting an expectation of coordination, clarity about intention, and central prioritization of preserving the right of speech and assembly, and that is a core function of it. The core function of the department is not just preservation of human life, not just preservation of property, but preservation of the right to speech and assembly. And I've heard those themes and police practices, really appreciate that. With a well-defined environment, all use of any tools or any weapons or any force will be more modulated to accomplish the goals in very difficult circumstances. And so for us, that was the priority, was agreements around what is the proper role of police, that is complicated, it's not a black and white or binary dynamic, and that police play a positive role in protecting the rights of especially marginalized perspectives, and that's very important and a really difficult job. I do want to say, no charge for this recommendation, but I think comments on those values, articulating the values and emphasizing the complex nature of harmonizing those values is the most important thing that the CPC can contribute to this conversation. I have heard everything that we back in the OG CPC would have wanted in terms of considerations that are called for in policy, being named by members of the department. What we also recommended though, so for many years we have seen the pattern of police, rank and file and command staff thinking that they were heard or that they were clear or that people understood, but actually people didn't. And I have been one of those people who did not hear that, or the orders that the people giving them thought were heard. And I can't stress enough that in all those years of receiving community input, the damage done to the relationship between the department and members of the public generally occurred because of people thinking thinking that their point of view was clearly seen by the other players, and it absolutely wasn't. So we always recommended, and I'm not seeing a current theme of after action consultation with people involved in significant events in the immediate, not a multi-year later sentinel event type of process, but, or not even an annual review, an immediate touch base with what did it feel like and look like out there, so that the department can incorporate that point of view in after action consideration. And it's not about blame, and it's not about wrongful conduct, it's about conduct that landed in a way that may not be well understood by members of the department for incorporation in future planning.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Yeah.
Is that something that you're identifying as absent from the current proposed ordinance, but would be useful to be included in it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I don't know that it needs to be in the ordinance. I think it's a good practice and it could be incorporated in policy. So we just recommend that it be done because things go better when it is done.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a
Yes.
question?
Yes.
Brian, may I put you on the spot and ask you?
What I'm here for.
Can you remind me, the ordinance talks about OIG review. Can you tell me specifically what it says? I can't remember.
I think what it calls for is SPD and OIG to collaborate on an annual report of all crowd management uses of force in particular,
Thank
which
you.
we are already doing as part of the OIG's, now it's codified, but we do that as part of the annual review done by OIG annually.
Is that
In my
something-
personal opinion, that is overly bureaucratic, and it is could be a CPC role to more nimbly invite perspectives of people who were just involved in something that just happened. It really is like, it has to be near enough in time that you can have a meaningful conversation about that time that there was a bullhorn announcement, da-da-da-da-da. What we heard you say was da-da-da-da-da, and we tried to exit it actually, and you said there was egress through Pine, but actually those who went there couldn't get out that way. A year later, no one's gonna remember that. It's really, this is just retail level feedback. Like, this did not, the new Coke didn't taste good. I mean, it's just like good to know. And I don't see OIG annual review as capable of getting at that. So there's no there's only something to gain, nothing to lose by doing this, but it's an informal process that's really voluntary by the department. I want to talk about blast balls for a second before we run out of time. Our action on blast balls, like what I've heard is that blast balls are the least problematic because they were the first discussed in the lowest level, yet blast balls were the only tool that the CPC, OG CPC ever specifically called for a temporary suspension of use of, because there was such a large and consistent gap between what is thought like at this presentation level about how they work and how they actually worked in real life on the street. And the contradiction comes from, and we dug very deep into this and we don't have time to fully flesh this out, but I'll just say, in collaboration with SPD, super appreciated. We looked at the training, we didn't go to a training, but we looked at the training, we looked at the directions, we read about circumstances in which they, are recommended for use. And we are aware that there are use warnings that they can cause serious injury. And indeed, they did cause serious injury whenever they were used. And my own personal analysis of why is that you hear, we don't fire them at people, we fire them at a blank space, yet they are being used to disperse crowds. There aren't blank spaces in crowds that need to be dispersed. There are people moving chaotically and with all good intention, and they're also difficult to precisely aim, and then they have this sort of reverberation echo area. Probably for those reasons, it's very hard to use them properly for this purpose, I think is the problem. It's not misuse, it's just they're very hard to use for this purpose. As a result, multiple people, none of whom were perpetrators they were not the cause of the level 5, we didn't have level 5 or 6 then, but they were not the cause of a level 5 or a level 6 situation. They were journalists, observers, and participants in lawful protests. experienced serious injury, including an injury very near someone's eye. It is completely random that the eye was not lost. Burns, and including of an officer, which was the only, yeah, anyway, more to be said. This pattern was so consistent and so not, I just, like, it wasn't fair to the department to have that kind of results from what were intended to be warning shots, but they didn't, and they were not experienced as warning shots. And it was doing tremendous harm to, it was driving a large gap between what was being represented and what was being experienced by a wide diversity of people, none of whom were engaged in criminal activity, many of whom were engaged in constitutionally protected and city protected activity like observation. So from our point of view, the risk, liability, and consequences were so great that this called for, the left and the right hand were what SPD's point of view was about the risk of their tool and what people were experiencing as the consequences of the tool just did not line up. And we were calling for further conversations to line them up. And I don't think it's an accident that, you know, there haven't been problems since 2020 and you haven't fired any since 2020. If you had, I think based on our past experience, you would have seen problems. This tool cannot be used without problems, as far as I can tell, after paying very close attention to this for almost a decade now.
Can I ask a question, and then if we are over time, so we're gonna have to adjourn. You started your presentation with a comment to the effect of you know, the prior iterations of the